this episode, we are looking at a part of vulnerability management that frustrates almost every security team at some point, because finding weaknesses is often much easier than getting them fixed. New learners sometimes imagine that once a vulnerability is discovered, the affected team simply applies a patch, changes a setting, or upgrades a system, and the problem disappears. In real organizations, remediation can slow down or stall for many different reasons, even when everyone agrees the issue matters. Those reasons are called inhibitors to remediation, and they are the practical obstacles that get between awareness and action. Understanding them is important because security work is not just about detecting risk. It is also about recognizing why risk remains in place, what is preventing progress, and how those barriers shape the real exposure of the organization over time. A mature analyst does not stop at identifying the weakness itself. A mature analyst also notices what is standing in the way of fixing it, because that is often where the real operational story begins. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyberauthor.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. At the most basic level, an inhibitor to remediation is anything that delays, complicates, or prevents the correction of a known vulnerability. That inhibitor may be technical, procedural, organizational, financial, or even cultural. The key idea for a beginner is that remediation is not just a technical act. It is usually a coordinated business process that involves people, priorities, systems, approvals, schedules, and risk decisions. A vulnerability may be clearly identified, accurately reported, and assigned a serious severity rating, yet still remain unresolved because one or more parts of the organization cannot move quickly enough or confidently enough to address it. This matters because unresolved vulnerabilities do not become less real simply because the organization is busy. In fact, the longer an issue stays open, the more it can shift from being a technical weakness into a governance and accountability problem. When analysts understand inhibitors to remediation, they can help explain not only what needs to be fixed, but also why that fix has not yet happened and what kind of problem is actually slowing the process. One common inhibitor is technical complexity. Some vulnerabilities are attached to simple systems with straightforward update paths, but many are not. A weakness may affect an application that has many dependencies, a platform that requires extensive testing before changes can be applied, or a system so tightly connected to other services that one update could trigger unexpected failures elsewhere. In those situations, the fix is no longer just a patch. It becomes a change that must be understood, planned, and validated carefully. This is especially true in large enterprises where systems interact across departments and support critical business functions. Beginners sometimes think delay always reflects carelessness, but technical complexity often creates genuine friction. Teams may need to assess compatibility, check vendor guidance, coordinate downtime, or review potential side effects before they can act. None of that means the vulnerability is unimportant. It means the path to remediation is more difficult than the raw finding might suggest, and good security analysis takes that difficulty into account without minimizing the risk. Another major inhibitor is business disruption risk. Many vulnerable systems are not isolated lab devices sitting and used in a corner. They are production assets that support revenue, payroll, customer access, manufacturing, healthcare operations, or other business-critical services. If applying a fix could interrupt those services, the organization may hesitate, not because it ignores security, but because it is trying to avoid a different type of harm. This creates a real tension between security urgency and operational continuity. A patch that reduces cyber risk may also create downtime, performance issues, or application instability, especially if it has not been fully tested in the organization's environment. That tension does not excuse indefinite delay, but it does explain why remediation is often negotiated rather than automatic. For a new learner, this is an important lesson because it shows that cybersecurity decisions are rarely made in a vacuum. Security teams often need to persuade others that the risk of leaving the vulnerability in place is greater than the risk of controlled operational change, and that is not always an easy conversation. Ownership confusion is another frequent barrier, and it can quietly keep vulnerabilities open even when the technical fix is known. In many environments, security teams discover the issue, but they do not own the system, the application, the maintenance process, or the deployment pipeline that would actually resolve it. Infrastructure teams, cloud teams, application teams, product owners, database administrators, and business managers may all have some role, but if responsibility is unclear, the work can drift. One team may assume another team is already handling it, while the receiving team may not believe the issue belongs to them at all. The result is not necessarily disagreement in a loud or visible form. Sometimes it is just silence, delay, and lack of follow-up. For beginners, this reveals why remediation depends so heavily on governance and accountability. A vulnerability cannot be fixed by vague expectation. Someone must know who is responsible for evaluating the finding, approving the change, performing the work, validating the outcome, and reporting closure. When those responsibilities are blurred, remediation slows down even in organizations with technically capable staff. Poor asset visibility can also be a powerful inhibitor because it is hard to remediate what the organization does not fully understand. A vulnerability report may identify a host, application, or service, but the team reviewing it may not know who owns that asset, whether it is still in production, what data it handles, or how important it is to the business. In some cases, the asset inventory is incomplete or outdated. In others, the system exists in a cloud environment, a remote office, or a business unit that operates somewhat independently from central information technology teams. Without solid visibility, the organization cannot route the work efficiently or judge the urgency of the issue with confidence. The result is often delay while teams try to answer basic questions that should have been known earlier. This is one reason vulnerability management is closely connected to asset management. Security teams do not just need findings. They need context. When visibility is weak, remediation efforts waste time figuring out what the affected system is, who cares about it, and whether it is even still active. Legacy technology is a particularly stubborn inhibitor because older systems often do not fit modern remediation practices very well. Some run outdated operating systems that no longer receive regular vendor support. Some depend on custom software that may break if underlying components are updated. Others exist in industrial, healthcare, or specialized environments where the technology is old but still essential to operations. In these situations, the ideal fix may be obvious on paper, but difficult or impossible in practice. The organization may be unable to patch normally, unable to upgrade quickly, or dependent on a vendor that no longer provides timely support. This creates a dangerous situation where everyone agrees the risk is real, yet no simple remediation path exists. For a beginner, this is a helpful reminder that not all vulnerable systems are equally flexible. Some can be fixed in hours. Others require long-term replacement strategies, temporary compensating controls, or formal risk acceptance, while a broader modernization effort is planned. Legacy technology does not make the vulnerability less serious. It simply makes the remediation path much harder. Resource constraints are another inhibitor that appears in many organizations, even those that take security seriously. Remediation work competes with other demands for time, budget, staff attention, and technical expertise. A team may have a large backlog of operational work, a shortage of qualified personnel, or too many systems under its care to respond quickly to every finding. Security teams often see the vulnerability clearly and assume action should follow immediately, but the teams responsible for fixing it may already be overloaded with outages, business projects, regulatory deadlines, and maintenance obligations. This does not mean the vulnerability should be ignored. It means capacity becomes part of the real-world equation. For new learners, this is an important shift in perspective because it explains why even reasonable organizations can fall behind. The challenge is not always denial. Sometimes it is limited bandwidth. Strong vulnerability programs respond to this by improving prioritization, clarifying ownership, and helping leadership understand when the volume of known risk exceeds the organization's actual ability to address it within expected timeframes. Data quality problems can inhibit remediation as well, because teams are less likely to act quickly when they do not trust the finding. A vulnerability scan may produce duplicates, stale results, or false positives, especially in large environments with changing assets and uneven coverage. If technical owners repeatedly receive findings that turn out not to apply, they may become skeptical of future reports, even when those future issues are real and urgent. This is one reason validation matters so much. Remediation depends not only on detection, but also on confidence. A weak process that floods teams with noisy or poorly explained findings creates hesitation and fatigue. People start asking whether the issue is genuine, whether it still exists, or whether someone else has already fixed it and the data just has not caught up. That hesitation slows the response. For a beginner, the lesson is simple but important. The quality of vulnerability data influences the speed of remediation. Security teams that want faster response need findings that are credible, current, understandable, and tied to enough context that recipients can believe the issue is worth their attention. Change management can become another major obstacle, especially in environments where formal approvals, scheduled release cycles, and testing requirements are part of normal operations. These processes exist for good reasons. They help prevent rush changes from creating outages or introducing new problems into production environments. At the same time, they can slow remediation if the organization cannot balance control with responsiveness. A vulnerability might be identified today, but the next approved change window may not arrive for weeks. A fix may also need testing in a pre-production environment, review by an advisory board, or coordination across several teams before it can be implemented safely. For new learners, this shows how security and operations are often linked through structured process rather than direct action. The vulnerability may be urgent from a security perspective, but the change still has to move through an operational system designed to reduce service instability. Mature organizations try to keep that process disciplined without allowing it to become a permanent excuse for delay. When change management becomes too rigid or too slow, it shifts from being a safety measure into an inhibitor to risk reduction. Communication gaps and organizational culture can slow remediation even when the technical path is clear. A security team may describe a vulnerability in language that business or operations teams do not understand, making the issue seem abstract or disconnected from daily priorities. In other cases, the receiving team may understand the finding but not agree with the urgency because the risk has not been explained in terms that match the system's business value or exposure. Culture also matters. In some organizations, security is seen as a partner that helps teams make better decisions. In others, security is viewed as an external critic that drops problems onto already overloaded teams without helping them solve anything. That difference shapes how quickly people respond. If relationships are weak, remediation discussions may become defensive, slow, or adversarial. For a beginner, this is a critical insight because it shows that remediation is partly a human process. The ability to explain risk clearly, build trust, and align different teams around shared priorities can remove barriers that no technical control alone can solve. Vendor and third-party dependency is another common inhibitor, especially in environments that rely heavily on managed services, cloud platforms, commercial software, or specialized hardware. An organization may identify a serious weakness but discover that it cannot fully resolve the issue on its own. The fix may depend on the vendor issuing a patch, updating firmware, changing a managed configuration, or confirming support for a safer version. In some cases, the organization may be able to reduce exposure temporarily through segmentation, access control changes, or monitoring, but the permanent remediation remains outside its direct control. This can be deeply frustrating because the risk belongs to the organization even though part of the solution does not. For beginners, it is important to recognize that modern technology environments are full of these dependencies. Security teams often have to manage risk that sits partly inside someone else's product or service. Good remediation practice in these cases means keeping visibility on the issue, pushing vendors for timelines, documenting interim controls, and making sure leadership understands that the delay is not purely internal even though the exposure still matters. Misaligned priorities can also inhibit remediation, particularly when leadership attention is focused elsewhere. A security team may see a serious backlog building, but if decision makers are concentrating on product launches, mergers, audits, cost reduction, or major operational projects, remediation work may keep sliding lower on the practical list of what gets funded and staffed. This does not always happen because leaders are reckless. Sometimes they are making hard choices under pressure and do not fully understand the security consequences of delay. That is why reporting and communication are so important. If the risk is presented only as a technical issue, it may lose out to business initiatives that seem more immediate or measurable. When the same issue is explained in terms of exposure, regulatory implications, customer impact, or the likelihood of disruption, leaders are better positioned to act. For a new learner, this shows that remediation depends partly on how well security teams translate technical problems into business decisions. Priorities do not align on their own. They usually have to be made visible, negotiated, and reinforced through clear risk communication. There is also an important difference between a legitimate inhibitor and a weak excuse, and mature analysts learn to tell the difference. A system may genuinely require testing before a fix can be applied, but repeated delays with no plan for testing suggest a process problem rather than a technical one. A vendor dependency may be real, but the organization still needs interim protections and documented follow-up rather than passive waiting. A busy operations team may truly have capacity limits, but if the same critical vulnerabilities stay open for months without escalation, then the inhibitor has become a management issue. This distinction matters because not every delay is equally reasonable. Beginners should avoid assuming every unresolved issue reflects incompetence, but they should also avoid accepting delay without scrutiny. The key question is whether the organization understands the barrier, documents it, works around it where possible, and manages the remaining exposure consciously. Legitimate inhibitors are part of reality. Unchallenged excuses are a different problem. Effective vulnerability management requires the judgment to see which is which and the discipline to respond accordingly. By the end of this discussion, the main lesson is that inhibitors to remediation are not side notes in vulnerability management. They are often the reason known risk remains in place long after discovery. Technical complexity, business disruption concerns, unclear ownership, poor asset visibility, legacy systems, limited resources, weak data quality, rigid change processes, communication problems, vendor dependency, and misaligned priorities can all slow progress in different ways. For a new CySA Plus learner, the important mindset is that finding vulnerabilities is only part of the job. The deeper challenge is understanding what prevents remediation, how those barriers shape exposure, and what can be done to reduce delay without ignoring operational reality. Strong analysts help the organization see not just the weakness, but the friction surrounding the weakness. That is what turns vulnerability management from a scanning exercise into a practical security discipline. When teams understand the inhibitors clearly, they are better able to plan around them, escalate appropriately, and move from awareness toward real risk reduction.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.